All right, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Welcome everyone to the CMPros hosted webinar, Take Control of Your Website Migration. I am Saravanan Rajan, Vice President and a board member at CMPros. We'll be moderating the webinar today. We have David Hobbs, our presenter and independent subject matter expert on the website migration. Today's session is going to be an hour-long session with a brief introduction by myself, followed by David's presentation and a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please use the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel and post the question. We can organize all the questions and discuss that at the Q&A forum. Now about CMPros, for those who are not familiar with our organization and our LinkedIn group, we are a collaborative community of practice and advancing the field of content management. We are a no-fee open membership community, allowing the members to share their knowledge, experience, and expertise around content management. Our LinkedIn group is very active and discusses the various issues and best practices around content management. One of the services we provide to the community is frequently hosting the webinar such as this one, mostly around the interesting topic around content management. This month's topic, based on the huge demand and discussion threads around the website migration, we have partnered with David Hobbs to shed some light on the issues around website migration and how you can take control of it. In this webinar, David Hobbs, and a subject matter expert, will discuss some of the essentials of website migration. He'll talk about the various knobs you can tweak for a better migration while sitting at the controls. By thinking about this in advance, David will explain how you can improve the quality of your migrations with even less effort. You can also expect fewer surprises that can quickly derail your project. The knobs of diet, distance, and quality will be explained both for launch and longer-term success. One last thing before I turn it over to David, I strongly encourage you all to register with our community and the LinkedIn group if you have not done that already, to benefit from our services and other practice and knowledge sharing. With this, I'd like to give the floor to David. David, please give us a brief introduction about yourself and take us through the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot. Hi, thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for joining to participate in this webinar. Just to summarize what I do so that I can dive right into the content here, is I help organizations figure out how to transform their website. And a part of that is migration. And what I'm going to be doing is looking at how to better control your migration and how to plan for it a little bit better. I think a lot of organizations kind of look at a migration as kind of like pulling off a Band-Aid. You know it's going to be painful. You don't want to do it. You don't want to think about it. So one day you just go and rip it off. But what I hope to convince you of in this is that there's some control you can put on your migration so that it doesn't hurt as much, and it just results in a higher quality implementation for you. So what are these control knobs? The first is your raw weight. So this is the total amount of content you have, the pages, and the one thing, just as a quick aside, is that I usually try to look at a website migration quite broadly, so that it's also looking at migrating the relationships between sections, the functionality, the metadata. There's a lot of things that are getting migrated in a migration, but to keep things tight for this presentation, I'm just looking at it from the perspective of content. So anyway, back to the knobs. The first knob is raw heft, and so you can control how much content you're moving. Another is distance. So obviously you're trying to get somewhere from where you are now when you're doing a migration, and you can control how far you're going. And by phasing and other mechanisms, you can control that distance. But at a minimum, you want to be thinking about how far you want to go and whether you really can pull it off. The next one, the next knob, is quality. And this isn't just a yes, I want quality, or no, I don't. There are a lot of factors involved in quality, and you want to talk about that early on. And the next knob is how the content is handled. A lot of times people are looking at a migration as that kind of technical side of moving content from one system and putting it in another system, almost like a database transfer, maybe with some transformation mixed in. But there are steps before and after that that are important in the migration. So by looking at these in advance, you can hopefully avoid surprises, because a lot of times organizations face issues that appear to be surprises when really they shouldn't be surprises at all, because the issues could have been better anticipated. So let's look at the first control knob, which again is the weight, the raw heft, the size. And there are really two reasons that you want to control this. And really, in this, we'll concentrate on the first one. But one of the big opportunities you have in a migration is to reduce the size of your site so that you can focus it and improve the quality. You might, over time, because of political issues, different fiefdoms, kind of over time you've had different management, different styles, different systems. You might have a fairly inconsistent body of content, and some of your content may not even correctly focus the site visitor on what is important to your organization. So, the business strategy may have changed, and your website might not really reflect that anymore. And another reason to control the size is that less content is easier to migrate. Now, of course, right off the bat, a lot of people might have alarm bells going off in your head, because it might seem that, well, you've got 1 million pieces of content or 100. If I'm doing it automatically, what's the difference? It's the same cost, basically, a little bit extra time, storage, but it's basically the same cost. And that can be true if you have very consistent content. Or if you don't have consistent content, then it still might be possible to make it go be streamlined, but you might then have different rules for different pieces of content, which just means that really more content does mean more work. But for here, if we just concentrate on the need to cut back on content just to better focus your site, then I think that that's a useful focus here. So, yeah, it sounds great to have a smaller site. How do you do it? Well, first off, I would say that there are two main focuses with respect to a migration and reducing your weight of your website. One is to just set it as a goal. I mean, it kind of sounds obvious, and it really is, but even setting it as a goal is important. And on the next slide, we'll look at ways of kind of breaking down exactly what your goal is, and then also tracking against that goal. So are you actually moving toward your objective? And then another key point, I think, is that you want to separate out what's easy from what is important. A lot of times when I'm involved in a project, I help to improve the dialogue between the technical team and the editorial team, or the marketing team, or communications team, because there can be a wall here where the technical team might say, well, we can't do that because the tool doesn't do that, or it's just something we can't do, and then the communications team might just take that as the way things are. But a lot of times it's more, hey, it's possible, right? But it might not be worth it. But let's separate out what's really possible from what's not possible at all, and then think about what do you want. So getting to the vision of what you're trying to accomplish. So a couple specific approaches of how to reduce the size of your site. First is the one that just happens naturally, which is natural attrition. So if you've got a migration that you're doing manually, then when you hand off different sections of the site to the owners to do the migration, let's say, well, naturally, the things that they don't think are important aren't going to get migrated. Similarly, if it's automated, perhaps the things that are easy to do get done, and what's not easy doesn't get done. Or if you're doing Plan B, if you have done some Plan B analysis and you come to Plan B, well, then naturally less content gets moved. So those are kind of naturally what happens for content to get reduced. But then there's also rules-based, and I'm going to talk more about that in a sec. And the idea is that you are a little bit more methodical about what you keep and don't keep in a migration. So first, let's look at this concept of setting a goal and tracking it a bit more. What we have here is on the left is a pie chart showing for migration what the disposition is of content. And then on the right is showing the progress against that goal. And so you can imagine on the left, this is what you could show to management, and everybody looks at and says, yeah, I know what we're trying to do. So in this example, the dispositions are what's getting dropped. So you can see that if the whole pie chart is all the content that you currently have, you might drop a large chunk. Next largest chunk might be this is content that's just staying where it is, it's staying in place. The next might be you're moving it as is. Maybe there's transformation, but it's basically moving as it is. And then another category could be you're rewriting the content. So this would be where editorially, and here I mean intellectually, nothing technical at all. This could be somebody doing it on a pen and paper. This has nothing to do with technology, but there might be some content that has to be rewritten, maybe because of the focus issues that your site is encountering. You need to actually rewrite some content. So that's what that red wedge represents. Then on the right, this is how you might track against this. So again, just to carry the same example forward a bit more, going from the rightmost to dropping, perhaps there's no effort in dropping, so basically you're done with that. Staying in place, again, maybe in your situation, nothing needs to happen for the system to stay in place. Maybe you basically just link to the old system and everything just stays the same. Maybe you haven't even started moving any of the as-is content, so that would still be remaining in red. And then maybe the rewriting, you've done half of it so far. So the idea again here is that you set a goal and you track to it. And now going over to rules-based culling, we talked a bit about naturally how some content might get cut, but you can be a little bit more methodical about it. And so one way to look at it is in these 4 steps where you've got first the inventory, and it's very easy not to do an inventory when you're doing a migration, and there are a lot of reasons to do an inventory, but we can concentrate on the culling right here. After that, you define rules and say things like, well, if the content's over a year old, we're going to delete it. If it's a press release and it's less than 6 months, then we're going to move it as is. But if it's less than a month, then we're going to add the new way we do timestamping or something. And then the last step is then there's confirmation, where you look at, okay, we define these rules. Let's see if this actually makes sense in examples of the the different content and how it's identified for culling. And then there's the implementation. So to go to the first step of the inventory, you'll see here an example, and I just threw this together as an example where it's just an 11-page site. Obviously, you're not going to go through all this rule stuff for a tiny site, but just to illustrate it, I put it down here. So on the left, you've got the pages. The next column would be what type of page it is. then maybe the page views in the last month or something. The next one might be, you had different Dreamweaver templates over time. There's version 1 and version 2, and which version of the template is that on? And then the last one would be the business focus, which might be, outside of anything having to do with the website at all. What's the focus? So maybe, the Power Blaster is going to be what everyone's selling the heck out of soon. So that's just a high business focus. And one thing to just point out is that in this example, obviously the content or the metrics is coming from different systems. So in this example, the page names from the CMS, the types maybe from the CMS, perhaps the page views from Google Analytics, the template version might be from scraping the pages, and the business focus is from somebody going through and identifying what are the high priorities. So there's a lot on content inventories. You might want to see the Rethinking the Content Inventory series on my website, and there's the URL for that if you're interested. Then there's culling. Then there's defining the rules. And so here, in this example, I just threw out some ideas of what the culls could be for this. So the first rule would be like, if the business focus is high, then you are going to edit it. So again, like somebody's actually going to intellectually think about what needs to happen to that content. If it's less than 6 page views in the last month, then drop it. Page is version 2, move as is. So you can imagine that you can have these kind of rules that, obviously one of the advantages of doing it by rules is that you're negotiating with everybody on rules, not on specific pages. Now, of course, there might be exceptions, but the basic idea is that you're saying, hey, these are the rules. Does everybody agree with the rules? And then there's less, discussion on a case-by-case basis. Then there's the confirmation step. So again, just carrying through this example of a fictitious 11-page site. You can then see, all right, well, what's the breakdown? If we apply these rules, what's the breakdown? And here, the as-is is 36%. 36% of the content is as is according to the rules, and you can imagine that maybe you can click around, you can click on that wedge and see, okay, well, what are the 4 pages, and does it make sense when we thought the rules made sense, but let's just confirm that they do make sense looking at examples. So that's rule-based culling. Some other quick thoughts on weight loss for a website. One is, to try to avoid yo-yo dieting, or just yo-yoing once and cutting content, and then immediately you run into the same issues again immediately after launch. And really, to do this over the long term, there's a lot of broad issues to look at, and I'd recommend looking at this website web post. The web diet and the URLs there, that's on the Wilson Pierpoint site, looking at some issues around governance and web operations management. And then another point is that really following up on the yo-yo dieting, if you have rules and you've cut during the migration based on the rules, well, then maybe you can carry over those rules and continue using them on an ongoing basis. And so to close out this knob of how much content are you moving, what's the weight of what you're moving, really the reason to turn down the knob here is that you'll have a more focused site and an easier migration. And before I go on to the next knob, just another point is that you can turn all these knobs to 11 if you want. But the point is that you want to think through what the impact of making those decisions are, and really think through, do I really want to spend that effort to or suffer the bad consequences, for example, of migrating too much content by turning it all the way up. All right. So the next one is the next control knob is distance. And here I spoke about it briefly in the introduction, but obviously you're migrating, you're moving from one place to another, and so there's a distance you're traveling. And looking too much at the absolute, I've seen tons of gee whiz, really impressive strategies of where a website, where somebody wants to take their website, but you've got to get there. You've got to actually travel there. So we already talked about weight. It's kind of how much stuff you're taking, but there's also the distance. And kind of from physics, I guess it's weight over distance is power, or is that with time? But anyway, the weight and distance are two important aspects. So just to concentrate on two dimensions for a second on the distance that you're traveling. If we look just at the front end changes and the back end changes, we can start analyzing a bit more about how far you're traveling. In this one, the x-axis at the bottom is the impact on the front end. So this is what the site visitor sees. Then the y-axis on the side, that's in the back end how much change there is. So looking at the front end, the most difficult thing you can do is to actually completely revamp the site, where you change the functionality, you change the look, you change the IA. The visitor really is seeing something very different. That's the hardest. Then brand new would be you have a site that you're creating from out of the blue. That's less relevant here because we're talking about migration. One down would be a facelift, where you maybe you're changing some CSS and a little bit of light HTML, but it's not a significant change to the end user. And then another possibility would be either just changing how a sub-site works for the site visitor, or even just leaving the site the way it is from the site visitor perspective. And then on the back end side, you've got platform change, which is the most difficult, a brand new platform, which is meaning you're creating a site from scratch. Again, that's back down with the brand new on the other axis. That's not as relevant here for migration. And then you've got different options on down here on the platform side. But often people, when they're going into a migration, are thinking about being way over in the upper right. They're doing a platform change and a revamp. And just that's quite a distance to travel. And it might be worth it, and that might be the whole reason you're doing it, but just to be aware that that is tougher to accomplish than, for example, doing a light facelift with a platform change. And so these are just two dimensions with respect to the distance that you're traveling. And here are some others. There's the IA changes. If you're going to be changing the information architecture dramatically, then there may be a lot to think through about how you're going to, travel between the two. There's a lot of possibilities of how deeply structurally the content needs to change. And again, the reason that this is in the distance side is that if you have some new design that requires a lot of deep structural changes, you've got further to go than if you have a design that does not require that. In the new version of the Website Migration Handbook, there's some description about how to compare sitemaps and how to look at the texture of content to try to figure this out. But there's some other distance decisions here too. I won't read through them all, but the basic idea is that if you can turn down the distance you're traveling, then you've got less planning and also just less work to do. Now let's go on to quality. And so this is actually really important, and I think a lot of times this is looked at kind of in an overly simple way, which is like, yes, we want high quality. Well, what often happens if you look at it just like that is that you end up with a lot of surprises where deep into the process you discover that, hey, the communications team was expecting that all the links would point to the new site, and they're not. And if this kind of thing isn't worked out in advance, then there are issues. And I actually am finding that I'm talking earlier on with clients about this, because it's also a very concrete way to talk about the migration. So to look at some of the quality level questions, and there are many more, but just to give a flavor for what some of these are. And in a sense, the quality level knob is really a bunch of knobs because there's a lot of different variables here. But one of the first things to look at is what elements or components or assets are not managed now that you're going to be managing in the new system. So let's say you have a really image-rich site, and one of the whole reasons that you're moving to a new system is that you want to be under more of a digital asset management framework where you've got the images stored one time and then they're rendered multiple times. Or yeah, so let's assume for a sec that's what's going on. Well, the current content probably has hard links right to that, right to those assets. And so you want to think through, am I moving them in as a managed asset or not? And then if I am moving them in as a managed asset, just to use the image example some more, does it have to be resized? How do I know if they're duplicates? You know, so there's a lot in each of these. There's a lot of depth here. Related to that is how links within the content are going to be handled. You've got links from the content that's migrated to content that's not being migrated, and all these different variables and depths of links. And you know, how's that going to be handled? Is the content itself going to be rewritten to point to the new link, or is you going to handle this just by redirects and you're going to keep the old links in place? A lot of variables there. And another quick point about redirects, it's almost always a good idea to keep track of the old URL to the new URL during the migration, because it also helps during QA. But that's another whole discussion. And so you can see that there's some other questions here, and they're gobs more. And I would just point out that even if you already have, you know, set exactly what tools you're going to use, who the team is, I still think that working through these questions of what level of quality you're going to get are important, because it does limit surprises. I mean, in a migration, you're going to have surprises, but you can limit the surprises. And another point on the QAing is when you're looking at these different quality aspects, you want to think of who's going to make that happen. You know, it's easy to list that we want all this quality, but if you don't tie somebody's or group's name to it, then it might not happen. And you know, a lot of times it would be the technical team that would make some of these things happen, but sometimes it might need some editorial or creative or other team input. And also you want to look at who and also how this is going to be tested. So some elements you might say, well, we don't need to test. We are highly confident it's going to work. And others you might think that, well, we're going to check on a kind of percentage basis. We're going to check 1% or whatever. But when you're looking at the quality, that's an important aspect. How are we going to even confirm that that was attained? So by using this dial, you can have better quality and improved QA process. And you might even decide to have lower quality, but at least you're not backing into that at the last minute. The last knob is content handling. And really, I think that often the migration part, kind of like I was mentioning before, but just to use an example here, is looked at almost like moving day, where you know you see the image in the background here, where there's a moving truck. Let's say you're moving houses, and a lot of people look at the migration as moving day, and everything's already in boxes, and all you have to do is move all this stuff. You know, gather some friends around, give them pizza, and you're done with the migration or the move. But how did all that stuff get in those boxes? You can pay somebody to do that, but then you probably are moving things that you don't really want to move. And you know, somebody's taken that couch down the ramp there. Well, maybe that couch has a broken leg, and it's had a broken leg for years, but if you were going to actually move it, you might think, well, I like this couch, and we've got to fix it before the move because it might break when it gets moved. And then what about on the other side when you are in the house, you've moved? Well, where does this stuff go? If everything's just dumped in the front, then there's still a lot of work once you're in the house. And so this gets to a blog post, a topic of a blog post that Dean Barker recently published on moving and empty rooms, where, yeah, you want to think through, where's the stuff going? Are empty rooms okay, or are they not okay? Right, to sort of back out of the metaphor of the moving day, moving houses for a sec, let's look at concretely what some of these steps are. The first, and I like to look at it as these 6 steps. And you may find that in your project, one or many of these steps don't really make sense, but I think that at least thinking about them is a good lens to look through when you're considering your migration. So the first step is sorting. And, you know, getting back to that pie chart before, that was kind of the result of a sort where you say, well, this content I'm going to drop, this content I'm going to rewrite, etc. And hopefully the sorting you can do with just rules again, because obviously it would be more money if every time you encounter a new piece of content, you have to like make a decision about it. So you kind of want to avoid that. So hopefully that's by rules. And there are lots of different buckets you can put things in. There's move as is. There are different levels of as is. It can be that you move the HTML entirely as is versus you have to transform it. Maybe the different sections. Maybe, you know, the old articles you had, you can move completely as is, whereas others you have to transform. You might set up an archive section of your site and put some content in that archive section. So you might have an archive bucket. You might have a move now versus move later. So there's a lot of, it really depends on your project, but nonetheless there's a step of sorting, and hopefully you can do that by rules. And the next would be, where do you place the content? So back to the empty room issue. If you're changing your IA, you really need to look at how you're mapping between the IAs, and can that mapping be done automatically, or does some thought need to be put into it every time? And it may be fine to have some empty rooms at the beginning. You may move some stuff and realize that there's no place that it's going to display at first, or there's no content for a section, so you just don't launch that section. But the point is to think about this and to think, where's everything getting placed? Again, hopefully this could be done by rules, but you might have cases where you have to make decisions, like editorial decisions on it. You know, for example, if you have a site where the whole reason that you're doing a migration is that you're restructuring it at a deep level, like you're going to be splitting pages that are currently one page, things are PDFs where you're going to make them multiple web pages. You know, there might be big sections that you actually have to place manually. Then there's the edit step, and this gets to that rewrite wedge in the pie chart we were looking at before. And that is, again, intellectually what needs to change. So this is nothing to do with technology. This is, I could do it on, you know, in TextPad and rewrite, but the idea is that you may have to rebrand, refocus. Maybe the style is not consistent from a language perspective, but there may be an editorial step. Then there's the move and transform step. After that is enhancement, and that's where if your content needs some, you know, additional, for instance, tags, to make things work on the new site, you might need to do some tagging. And I understand that sometimes enhancing and placing can be largely the same thing, but they are a different flavor for many projects. And then last is QAing. And so what you want to do when you're looking at this, at these steps, is think also about how much it's going to cost to do each step. Now, some of these steps may be manual, some may be automated, for example, and you want to think, okay, for this group, so let's say that we have a section of peer-reviewed articles, or a journal of peer-reviewed articles, and those we can move as is. So maybe there's no sorting because you know the content type. The placing is known. It's going to go into the journal section, and you know how the different issues are volumes and issues are set up. So there's no placing. You don't need to edit. The move can be automated. The enhancing maybe doesn't need to happen. And there's going to be like a spot check QA. So you might say, well, that's not going to take much time. But then a hairy section that needs to be rewritten, well, maybe the sorting is easy, the placing is expensive, the editing is expensive, and the QAing and enhancing are expensive. But you can imagine that what you would do is you'd have the different buckets on the left, and then these different steps, and then you put how much you think it would be for each one, how many there are. So, there are 1,000 peer-reviewed articles. Each one's going to cost this, so the total cost we think is going to be this. And you do that for the different buckets, and you can kind of come up with how much it's going to cost. And there's a kind of a natural loop then back to the quality discussions and distance, et cetera, discussions, because you look at it and you might say, oh my gosh, this is going to cost a lot to pull this off. We don't think we can do it. So we need to revisit what it is we're even attempting to do. So in summary, for the 6 steps for the content handling knob, the reason to use this knob is that you'll understand the manual effort earlier, you reduce the effort, and you'll improve the quality. And one thing that I wanted to include here, admittedly this is veering a little bit off of migration, but I think it's relevant because a lot of times the migration is kind of, almost by definition, it is a one-time thing. I mean, there's cycles within it and you iterate, et cetera, but there is a start and an end to it. But I think if you look too literally at that, you end up with Frankenstein's monster because because of different concessions you might make with the different groups within that are involved with the website, you end up creating an incoherent site where you kind of bolted on this functionality for this special interest and this functionality for another, and that meant that the migration was more complex because we had to do this, and that meant that the different groups, their content's a little different, so that makes it harder to deal with in the future. So I would just suggest that you think of your website as a product, and it needs to be product managed, like an iPad has product management. How does it keep coherent over time? And so some of the things to do here are, one, to think in terms of your website as phases. This can be just on an ongoing basis in the steady state where you've got, you're always just thinking a little bit ahead because you want to be able to react. And so you define what you're about to do, you do it, and then you think, okay, given where we are now, what do we do? And you can keep iterating. That would fit in on the migration side. Potentially, you can reduce the distance at the beginning by creating phases that make that happen. And also you want to involve stakeholders during the migration. When migration starts, you might have a big spike in requests. This is when people might start really using the system, and they might say, well, hey, the way that I enter content is not working for me. It needs to change like this. Well, if you start just knee-jerk reacting to it, again, you can end up with Frankenstein's monster. And so you want to think of, like, what's the process? How am I managing this? And finally, I would just say that related to all this is to make sure that at the beginning, set the vision for what you're attempting, and make sure the requirements get to that, and the requirements are, just enough for what you need, but not getting beyond that so that you can also be phasing and reacting over time. So to summarize these controls, one is, to take a seat at these controls. I think that's, probably the most important message, is that it's not just a Band-Aid that comes at the end and you just want to rip it off. You want to plan this to avoid surprises and set yourself up better for the long term. And there are many controls, but just to review the ones that we covered here, there's the raw heft with the weight. So you want to try to scale that back. Perhaps by rules you can do that, but at any rate, I highly recommend looking carefully at your inventory to understand what you're encountering. And you want to think about focusing your site better. There's the distance. Sure, you want to get to wherever, but you want to think about how far that is, and you want to keep that as small as possible, potentially by phasing. On quality, it's not an either-or. You've got a lot of different options to consider, and you want to talk about that early on. It's a very concrete way to talk about what's expected. And then on the content handling, there's remember that we're not just talking about that one movement of content and that's it. There's the processes leading up to it and after. And then finally, I'm really excited that I'm announcing the version 2 of the Website Migration Handbook. So you guys are the first ones that this is available for. You would need to enter that special code, CM Pros are cool, and you can go to migrationhandbook.com/v2, and it's also 50% off. This is a PDF version, and as I mentioned, it covers more on the content analysis and has a completely rewritten section on maintain. So I hope that's of use to folks. So I guess now I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, David. While I was watching your presentation, I received a few interesting questions, and I had a few questions by myself as well. One of the questions I had is, what are the best practices around validation post-migration? I know that would be the biggest challenge. QA, I think you covered the QA section, but I think what are the key areas that you would look for post-migration?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think that one of the best things to do, I think, is to in advance think through like what's the most important. What do I need to give the most attention to? Because whether or not you're doing automated validation or manual validation, you need to know where to place your focus. So that's one thing. I would also say that a best practice, getting back to the one thing I kind of parenthetically mentioned, or I should say a better practice. In general, the term best practice makes me a little nervous, but a practice is to make sure to keep track of the old URL to the new, because when you get down to the manual validation side, the best way to do that is side by side. And if you kind of throw out that information during the migration, you might not be able to do that easily. So, to expand on that more, when you're going through to validate whether the migration went well, if you can have, like a spreadsheet that lists the old URL to the new URL, and I appreciate that sometimes the URL, stays the same, but just conceptually, if you've got those two, then you can click and see side by side what they are. Because when you look at a page on its own, you have no idea whether it migrated well or not. You know whether it migrated poorly because it might have blatant errors. But for example, if an image is gone and it wasn't supposed to be there, you're only going to know that if you're looking side by side. And then on the validation side, there are definitely scraping tricks, et cetera, that you can do to basically read off the page to see if it met your expectations. So, again, if you know that one of the reasons that you're doing, that one of the things that you want is let's say a more data-rich site, and you had tables within HTML before, and now you want them to be interactive components where people can filter and reorder and stuff. Well, that might be something that you want to go through and make sure there are no tables in the new site. Anyway, so those are just some ideas.
Great, thanks. I think one other question I received from the audience is, does SEO fit within the quality section? In optimization, does it fit within the quality section?
Yeah, I think that is important. That that can definitely be a surprise. That if in the end you wind up with URLs that are causing you problems, or also with that that step of enhance that in the content handling step, it's also there where if you kind of set it as a goal that you want to have descriptions written in a specific way or something, the meta tag description, then that might need to be a step that has to occur to make that happen. So I think it's both in the quality where you talk about, well, what are we even going to accomplish in this migration with respect to SEO? But then there's also the side of, well, how are we going to make it happen? And that might be in that enhanced side. Or it could be that there's something automated that could be done about that as well. But at any rate, I think it fits in both of those camps, the quality and then also steps of how you're going to make it happen.
Perfect. One other question, I think, how do you handle rewrites that impact the usability or the information architecture through the technologies like Ajax, or making the site more mobile friendly? Now that we have all those smartphones, most of the websites are targeting towards that smartphones.
Yeah, so in general, this gets to how much the content needs to be restructured, and I think that one of the most important things is that similar to on the QAing side, you can't just look at a page and tell if it went well. You can see if it went bad, but you can't tell if it went well. I think the same thing when you're transforming the content, and let's say one of your main goals is to make it more mobile device friendly. Well, there's this distance, again, you're traveling there, where it could be that it's trivial to make that happen. Perhaps your editor now I'm talking on the HTML editor. Maybe you've got a CMS. The HTML editor is restricted to only allow P tags and A tags. And hey, with no styling, let's say. And then, hey, if that's the case, then mobile is going to be trivial because all of the well, I shouldn't say trivial because there might be other things that you're trying to introduce, like have less content. But just at the first cut, just to look at the texture of the content, there is that you've got to look at where you are now to where you need to go, and there may need to be a automated transformation. On the rewrite side, let's say that you decide that it's not just about how it renders, but I want it to be less content. Well, then at that point, you may need to rewrite, and that gets to you thinking about, well, what content's the most important? Because if you have a huge site and you're saying that you want to have tighter content, less, for each piece of content, less text, then you need to think, like, is it worth rewriting? It might be like getting to that bucketing, that the more recent stuff you rewrite, the older stuff maybe you truncate. Of course, there are other tools like Teragram and things where you can be doing extraction of summarization and stuff. But in general, again, you would need to look at what is it that I'm trying to get to, and then hopefully through like bucketing things, you can separate out what needs to be done manually by manually rewriting, and then maybe a lower quality what can just be truncated or kept as is. Anyway, so there's some ideas on that.
Thank you. I think there is one interesting question from the participant. I think everyone faces the same challenge like this participant. The question is, in an extremely dynamic and content-heavy business environment, what additional steps one can take to manage content migration along with the continuous ongoing enhancements to your websites or web assets?
Yeah. So there are a lot of things that you can do here. One of the things that I like to look at is that you've got the fairly stagnant content, and then you've got the dynamic content. Now I'm talking about with respect to being updated. So I'm not talking about flash versus static. I was talking about now kind of how frequently the updates are. You've got some content that isn't updated very often at all. Well, that can be migrated kind of whenever you want, basically. So that can be done from a phasing perspective. It can be done early on. You can start identifying problems and kind of be a little bit more leisurely about that. And then you've got the more dynamic things that you want to, again, analyzing your publishing dynamics and your content. You might realize that, well, really it's the last 2 weeks content that's really what's dynamic, and we need to worry about it. And then maybe after you've done all of this migration of the content from the past, then you've got a pretty solid understanding of what needs to happen, and then you could have just a short window where you migrate in everything else. So that's one, technique on the very, that dynamism side. Another possibility, I mean, this is low tech, but, I've got a client that's doing this right now, for example, is, double entry too. So, that's another, maybe boring way to look at it, but that's another possibility.
Yeah, that has always been a challenge. I think everyone sees in their day in migration of activities.
Yeah.
One another question. I think this is about this. When you do this automation migration, you do a lot of page scraping and then assembling the content. Are there any tools in particular you would recommend for those kind of activities?
I don't have any particular tools to recommend. At some point I've got to do some kind of analysis of different tools, but I don't have any particular tools. I mean, obviously some of the heavy hitters are Kapow and Famosa. Famosa with now as a service, but those are some of the heavy hitters. But there are others as well, and it also depends on which systems you're going into. I mean, the one thing that I would point out, though, in whatever you're using, and I don't have a particular recommendation to answer that direct question. No, I don't. But is that there's a lot outside of what is happening with those tools, and so by concentrating too much on that automation side, I think you can miss out on some of the other aspects. But no, I don't have a particular recommendation.
That has been a challenge as well. I think balancing out between automation and the manual migration efforts. Very good. One another before we wind up this webinar is the question about is associating a migration cost per page migrated. Does it help the team to remove the content more aggressively? Does it help the content owners or to say, okay, this content you can remove, this is obsolete kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with when it's down to particular content items is that it just becomes a little bit harder to logistically deal with it. There's the back and forth. There's then, if you're using spreadsheets, there's the inevitable synchronization problem between spreadsheets. I mean, you can use other reporting tools so that it's all synchronized, but the problem with the kind of one-off decisions is just that it's harder to manage, and then you get into longer discussions. But certainly, if the owner says that content isn't needed anymore, then that can help. I would just hope again that it could be a little bit more rule-based than just discussions on particular pieces of content. I mean, of course, for a small site that could work, but in general, my focus is more on the larger sites, and I think on those, the more rules you can have, the better.
Okay, great. I think now we are at the close of the session, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank David Hobbs. Thank you, David. We had a wonderful session. It was very useful to us. I'm sure the participant and the audience have really enjoyed it. There are many questions. What we would do is we would gather all the questions and we'll post a response. David get response from David Hobbs and post it to our LinkedIn website and also email them to you. I would encourage you to look for your emails for the future invitations of such webinars. We would be posting a lot more webinars such as this interesting topic. And I greatly appreciate everyone joining us, and thank you all. You all have a good day. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.